I think maybe we ought to make a start. Can I just check, first of all, that the sound is okay? Is that clear? Okay. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is to thank you all very much for coming back again, and also for some very interesting questions during at the end of the previous two lectures. So thank you very much for that. Yesterday, I covered Plaatje as a political figure, the issues that he engaged with, the political and social context in which he operated. But of course, Plaatje is also well known today as a literary figure as well, particularly, I think, for having written what's regarded as the first full-length novel in English by a black South African, Mhudi, an epic of native life 100 years ago. That's the subtitle. It's an important book, and the subject, in fact, of a considerable critical literature in its own right. And I'll certainly have something to say about it. But I want to take, in this lecture, a bit of a broader view of the range of Plaatje's literary achievement. And to do so by considering, first of all, some of his other writings in English, and specifically to look at his Mafikeng diary, and also, quite briefly, because we'd looked at it before, Native Life in South Africa, as well as Mhudi itself. But then secondly, to look at Plaatje's writings in Setswana, something that he particularly applied himself to in the last 3 or 4 years of his life. And by looking at both together and at the relationship and the connections between the two, I think it's possible to gain some new insights into the nature of his achievement. So, English, first of all, and Plaatje's Mafikeng diary. And he began it late in October 1899, a couple of weeks after the siege of Mafikeng began. This is actually the first page, and you can see his fairly bold handwriting. It varies a bit the way that it's actually written. Sometimes it's written in pencil. Sometimes he actually uses shorthand. Sometimes a friend of his was actually writing in the diary and writing down what Plaatje had dictated to him. So it's quite a kind of interesting mixture has gone into it. But this first page is written by Plaatje himself. He kept going with it until the end of March 1900. That's about 6 weeks before the siege ended. Now, he never said why he wrote the diary. At least I've not come across anything to indicate that. But it was certainly the case that a lot of other people in Mafikeng at the beginning of the siege were doing exactly the same. I think they all kind of rather felt that it was an important historical episode that they found themselves in the middle of. And that they better just sit down and write. And I think it was also the case that there probably wasn't, for a lot of them, too much else to do at the same time. But I think Plaatje was also familiar with the genre of the diary. And we do know that he used to carry a pocketbook with him, which he may well have used to practice his writing, as well as using it for kind of writing notes of expenditure and all of that. And actually we know about that pocketbook because it helped him to win a court case a few years before, where he had a dispute with his landlord, and he was able to come up with the evidence of when he'd made the payments, and that basically persuaded the magistrate to rule in his favour. But I think this diary that Plaatje embarked upon was very much a private journal. It wasn't something that he thought of getting published, or that he wrote in with publication in mind. In contrast, for example, to the diaries kept by some of the journalists, war correspondents, who were in Mafikeng and who saw it an ideal opportunity to get a publication out of it. So Plaatje wrote about his own thoughts and memories, making some interesting connections between past and present, as well as describing the events of the siege going on around him and the people that he had dealings with. So something I think that he wrote for himself, and perhaps he also envisaged it as a record for his wife Elizabeth if he did not survive the siege. She was safely out of Mafikeng in the southern part of the colony. So here is how Plaatje begins. If you can't read what's up there, this is actually what he says. And I just wanted to give this as a kind of example of his writing. And he begins, "Divine services, no thunder, haikona terror. And I've therefore got ample opportunity to sit down and think before I jot down anything about my experiences of the past week. I've discovered nearly everything about war and find that artillery in war is of no use. The Boers seem to have started hostilities, the whole of their reliance leaning on the strength and number of their cannon, and they're now surely discovering their mistake. I do not think they will have more pluck to do anything better than what they did on Wednesday, and we can therefore expect that they'll either go away or settle around us until the troops arrive. To give a short account of what I found war to be, I can say, no music is as thrilling and as immensely captivating as to listen to the firing of the guns on your own side. It's like enjoying supernatural melodies in a paradise, to hear one or two shots fired off the armoured train. But no words can suitably depict the fascination of the music produced by the action of a Maxim, which to Boer ears, I'm sure, is an exasperation which not only disturbs the ear, but also disorganises the free circulation of the listener's blood." And so he goes on. I think what comes across, I think, is a high degree of self-confidence and an exuberance, I suppose, along with, I think, quite a kind of ironic sense of humour, which actually then runs pretty much through the diary as a whole. Although both the exuberance and the humour dissipate rather as things get more difficult towards the end of the siege. But of course, a quality of writing and a sophistication of expression that I think is all the more remarkable when you consider that English was actually the third language that Plaatje learnt after Setswana and Dutch. So you can see how Plaatje uses his diary to practice, to try out new constructions, as in the rather convoluted musical metaphors in which he indulges, or elsewhere, for example, in the use of unusual words, such as funambulism, which is the art of tightrope walking, just in case you didn't know that. But I think he's also aiming, like other late 19th century diarists, to improve not just his English, but himself. And another passage a little bit later on, "This lateness appears to be a disease with which I'm infected, and I'll see that it does not occur again, as I feel very uncomfortable in consequence." I think that could almost have come from Diary of a Nobody by the Grossmans, if you're familiar with that. Let me give you another example of his humour, inspired in this instance by the incongruities of life under siege. I think the juxtaposition, which struck him in a number of different ways, of the normal and the abnormal. And this is what he had to say. "We had a civil court today. A lot of boys of the firm of Julius Weil are suing their employers for wages. Mr. Spencer Minchin, LLB solicitor, now Lieutenant Minchin, Bechuanaland Rifles, appeared for all the plaintiffs, and Mr. J.W. de Kock, attorney, now member of the Town Guard, appeared for the defence. It was a novel court. Only the parties concerned looked as usual, but not the court. The plaintiff's attorney was in military attire, lawyer for the defence, never shaved since the siege, all hairy, dressed in a third-hand suit without a collar, looked more like a farmer than an attorney. Myself, in knickerbockers and without a jacket, looked more like a member of a football team or a village cyclist than a court interpreter. All of the natives but one carried their cases." Now, as it happens, a photograph exists which pretty much represents exactly the scene that Plaatje has just described. You can see him standing behind the table, and J.W. Koch, the attorney looking more like a farmer, standing there with the hat. Now, whether that scene is precisely the scene that Plaatje is describing for that day in his diary or not, I'm not quite sure, but it was certainly corresponds pretty closely to his description. And later on, I think most of these passages that I quoted have been from the early part of his diary. Later on, he does get a bit more pessimistic, as do all the diarists. So you don't quite get the kind of the jauntiness and the humour. Now, curiously, Plaatje's Mafikeng diary has been largely neglected by literary critics and historians of South African literature. And why is this? Why might this be? I think probably a lot of it is down to the genre. I think diaries seem to fall between fiction and non-fiction, to be neither one thing nor the other, and critics have been unsure about how to treat them. It's actually been historians who've made more of Plaatje's diary, often citing it as a key source of evidence to show that the South African War was not just the white man's war that it was once thought to be. But I think Plaatje's diary deserves to be a lot more than just considered as a source of evidence. But I think there actually may be other reasons too why people have either neglected it or not been quite sure what to make of it. I think when it was first published in the early 1970s, which is when it actually first came to light, its subtlety and the sheer sophistication of its writing seemed at odds with predominant white conceptions of black capabilities. Where could it possibly have come from, given what was known at the time of black writing and black intellectual history? But at the same time, the diary seemed to be at odds with an African nationalist narrative that tended to see the past as a one-dimensional story of oppression and resistance, to disregard any form of expression that was not political in its focus. So people, I think, found it a bit difficult to understand, for example, Plaatje's pro-British sentiments, or his friendly relationships with the magistrate and the military officers, or his evident pride in his work, seeing all of this rather as a regrettable case of naivety or even of false consciousness. So from this kind of perspective, Plaatje should simply not have been thinking and writing and behaving in this way. His world, to put it another way, was no longer recognisable. So I think what I would simply do is urge you to read the diary yourself, and if you haven't already done so, and make up your own mind about it. And just to give you a sense, just gives you an idea of the editions that there have been. The red one was the original edition. It's actually quite interesting to sort of trace the different design, but also the different terminology that's used. So we start off with a Boer War diary. We then have a Mafikeng diary, a black man's view of a white man's war, and then the most recent one, and the one that if you wanted to obtain a copy is done on the right hand side, simply the Mafikeng diary of Salty Plaatje, the assumption being that Plaatje is actually quite well known and that he doesn't necessarily need to be speaking on behalf of anybody else to be significant and worth reading. They're basically the same book, but they have been re-edited, and there have been a lot more research has gone into the footnotes, and the manuscript itself is actually a lot more accurate than the one first time around. So if you do want to read one, I would certainly go for the most recent one. So the second book of Plaatjes in English that I wanted to look at is Native Life in South Africa. Now, this obviously came up in yesterday's lecture, where I argued that it should be seen as one of South Africa's most important political books. I don't propose to say all that more about it now, other than to point out that the impact that the book made, and in fact, and its continuing power today, derived not just from the strength of the case that Plaatje presented, but by how he went about it, and by the quality of his writing and the techniques that he used. And I quoted yesterday that opening sentence of Native Life in South Africa, which I think was a good example of what I mean. But Native Life was essentially an appeal. And so Plaatje uses often very emotional language to get his case across, to make the points that he wants. So in addressing the British public, which is what he's doing in the first instance, he makes a point of presenting his case in terms that are understandable and meaningful to them. It was all about establishing a connection, a relationship with his audience, and its cultural world and the assumptions that they had. So he likened the operation of the Land Act to an imaginary decree of the London County Council. He evoked memories of Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year by comparing it with the plague of the Land Act. He quoted from Oliver Goldsmith's The Deserted Village to draw attention to the parallels with the evictions that followed the Land Act, and so on. My point simply is that it's important to be aware of the skills and experience that Plaatje brings to writing Native Life in South Africa, that we should recognise its literary qualities as well as its political importance. And also, I think, recognise that really the one depends upon the other. And I think you could probably argue, actually, similar to the diary, that the Native Life in South Africa has also not quite had the full recognition that it ought to. And it's as though there's a kind of gold standard attached in the kind of literary tradition to fiction. So it's kind of novels are kind of upheld as, you know, as the most worthwhile form of writing, and something that has the kind of political function. Again, never quite gets the attention that it perhaps deserves. So I'd like to move on to Mhudi. And again, just to show you a selection of covers, which I think certainly make the point that Mhudi has been through a number of different editions and has become very widely read and popular, both I think generally, but also in schools and colleges. Mhudi was published in 1930 by the Lovedale Press. But it was actually written about 10 years before that in London in 1920. I think it's best described as a historical novel. And it tells the story of Mhudi, the heroine, and Rataga, her rather less impressive husband, both of them Barolong, and their adventures at the time of Mzilikazi's invasion. It's set in what was recognisably the 1830s. And it involved encounters not only between Barolong and Ndebele, but with Boers too, as they trekked northwards from the Cape Colony into South Africa's interior. Now, I think Mhudi is notable for a number of reasons, and I'd like to suggest that three stand out. Firstly, in Mhudi, Plaatje sets out to provide a rather different take on 19th century South African history, seeing it essentially from an African and a Barolong viewpoint. It had long rankled in his mind that the Boers had seized control of what is today's Free State province, betraying the Barolong who'd been their allies in the war against the Ndebele, and who had occupied much of this land before. Now, Mhudi is Plaatje's chance, I think, to put the historical record right, to tell the story from a different perspective. To interpret, I quote, to interpret to the reading public one phase of the back of the native mind, as Plaatje explains in the foreword to the book. So the Boers are portrayed not so much as the bringers of civilization to a hitherto benighted people, but as a vulnerable band of refugees, actually appearing only a third of the way through the book, who owed their survival to the succour provided by the Barolong chief Morocco. Morocco, who, far from existing in a state of savagery, was a wise ruler over a people who had already encountered Christianity. In fact, when they first met, the Boer trekkers were surprised to find the Barolong chiefs disputing some of their arguments by quoting the Bible at them. So a very different perspective on the Boer trekkers to their usual portrayal in the popular white imagination, and a tale that Plaatje told in order to show the roots of the policies of dispossession implemented in South Africa in the decade or so before the book was written. And there were always in this book implied parallels and a kind of assumed historical knowledge that Plaatje assumes on the part of his reader. Secondly, I think Mhudi is notable for the way that it draws upon and reworks very different literary traditions, the written traditions of English literature and the oral traditions of his own people, the Barolong, and anticipating, it's been argued, later writers from other parts of the continent like Chinua Achebe and Things Fall Apart, a novel that's often compared with it. Scholars have traced the influence of Shakespeare, most notably, but also Bunyan, even Rider Haggard. But in Mhudi, Plaatje clearly draws quite extensively upon the oral traditions of his own people as well. And thus his starting point in Mhudi, again as he explains in the foreword to the book, was the killing of Boya, who was one of Mzilikazi's emissaries. And this is what Plaatje says. This is how it started. By the merest accident, while collecting stray scraps of tribal history later in life, the writer incidentally heard of the day Mzilikazi's tax collectors were killed. Now, tracing this bit of information further back, he elicited from old people that the slaying of Boya and his companions about the year 1830 constituted the casus belli which unleashed the war dogs and precipitated the Barolong nation headlong into the horrors described in these pages. But Plaatje drew on family traditions as well. My mother, he wrote elsewhere, is a direct descendant of a grandson of Tau from the house of his youngest and dearest wife, Mhudi. So Mhudi must have been, if he's right about this, his great-great-grandmother. Now we do also know that Plaatje's great-uncle was one of those killed during the period of the Mafikeng, so those memories were handed down too, and that tales of Mhudi's bravery in the face of lions were actually based on what he'd heard from his own grandmother. So thirdly, there's the character of Mhudi herself. She's portrayed as a powerful, independent woman, far stronger and wiser than her husband, Rataga. Now, she's really the central, life-giving figure of the book, and she's constantly subverting the usual stereotypes of submissive female behaviour, so much so that Mhudi has often been characterised as a feminist novel. Now, this is certainly consistent with the views that Plaatje expressed elsewhere, and I think it's quite reasonable to see Mhudi as a tribute to the women in his life. His wife, Elizabeth, his daughter, Olive, to whom the novel is actually dedicated, to the white women sympathisers in England who were very much in his mind at the time the book was written, and who had actually tried very hard to help him to find a publisher for it in London. So what sort of reception has Mhudi had? What have the critics made of it? Now, when it was first published, Mhudi did get quite a few reviews. It certainly wasn't neglected. Most of the reviews were pretty favourable, including one, interestingly enough, on the radio from the studios of the African Broadcasting Company in Johannesburg. But not everybody approved. Stephen Black, who was the editor of a literary journal called the Sjambok, didn't like the way Plaatje's characters spoke in a stilted, high-sounding language, like Shakespeare, he said. And he felt Plaatje should not have been mimicking English literary styles. He would much rather Plaatje had written a realistic novel in the predominant English tradition. In other words, he should have written it in his preferred style. And he also thought it would have been much better if Plaatje had stuck to writing about his own people and not to try to involve and to bring in whites as well. Now these views, this line of thinking, it was actually echoed elsewhere. The Times Literary Supplement, which actually reviewed the novel a year after Plaatje's death, it thought that Plaatje should have focused on writing about his own people and have avoided Europeanism. One wonders, said the TLS review, what secret fountains of African art might not have been unsealed if, in interpreting his people, a writer of Plaatje's insight and thought had written like a native. Now others, thinking on similar lines, thought he should have written the book in Setswana and not in English. And even in the late 1970s, you have Masisi Kunene, the Zulu scholar and poet, criticising Mhudi for being inauthentic, a crossbred form that is neither African nor European. The romantic episode of Mhudi and Rotaga was, in his view, completely infantile. And overall, it was a second-rate, badly organised hodgepodge of semi-history, semi-fiction, shoddy allegory, a pastiche confusing fact and fiction in a most illogical manner. So pretty damning, really. What Kunene missed, I think, was Mhudi's humour, its quite intentional adoption and parodying of the romance genre, and any sense of Plaatje's agency, of the stylistic choices that he actually made. There are good grounds for believing that Plaatje had Rider Haggard's novel Nada the Lily particularly in mind, and that this was the particular object of his parody and satire. And it's quite instructive to look at the two alongside one another. So Plaatje's stylistic choices, I think, then become a lot clearer. Now, since Kunene's diatribe, views and reviews of Mhudi have been rather more positive. In the 1980s and 1990s, critics found in Mhudi a text for the new South Africa. Instead of criticism of its supposed lack of authenticity, critics highlighted its democratic credentials, its rewriting of history from a black perspective, its roots in oral history, the feminism of its heroine. And there have been several new editions, as well as translations into French, Italian, Dutch, and also Setswana. So today, Mhudi, I think it's fair to say, has a pretty secure place in South Africa's literary canon. There was also quite an interesting debate, which I think I can't really go into now, but I might come back to later if there is time, about the manuscript of Mhudi and whether what was published was what Plaatje wanted to be published, or whether it had been interfered with or influenced by the Lovedale Press. But it gets a bit complicated, quite interesting, but I'll come back to that if there's time. So, Mafikeng Diary, A Native Life in South Africa, Mhudi, I guess you could say that these are Plaatje's three key works in English. And I hope that I've tried to convey some idea of the response that there has been to them to provide some sort of context. But there is another dimension entirely to Plaatje's achievement as a writer, and that's his work in Setswana. Much of it sadly lost, but certainly some of it, enough of it, has survived to form a pretty good view. So Setswana, Setswana of course, was Plaatje's first language. He was fascinated by it from a very early age, and the tales and traditions that went with it. And there was always far more Setswana than English in the newspapers that he edited. Now, I think he saw Setswana not just as a means of communication, but as a means of drawing Tswana speakers together, promoting a consciousness of their wider identity as Botswana, rather than just adherents of one or other of the Tswana chieftains. So there was always, I think, a great deal at stake in Plaatje's mind when it came to the role and function of Setswana. But there were also huge problems. Setswana had no common orthography, the consequence of 6 different missionary societies of 4 different nationalities devising their own systems, reflecting and therefore accentuating different dialects. It meant that publishing authors writing in Setswana was often just not viable, and this created enormous obstacles to its development as a language. And Plaatje was always very conscious that Setswana was falling behind Sesotho, Xhosa, and other African languages. But Plaatje was determined to do something about it, and the opportunity I think first arose in London during the First World War, when he was in close contact with people who were much more appreciative of the value and worth of African languages than in South Africa. The 2 books that resulted were his Setswana Reader in International Orthography, written in conjunction with Professor Daniel Jones, who was a leading academic phonetics expert. And then Plaatje's solely authored Setswana Proverbs, which he compiled himself, drawing upon his own deep knowledge of the language and its traditions. And actually this was all done from memory while he was in London. And that's just to give you an idea of the title pages of those 2 books, and also Professor Daniel Jones, who actually played a pretty important part in Plaatje's life, because that book was actually the Setswana Reader was the product of some pretty long-lasting sessions where they were working together on a phonetic analysis of the language. And it was, quite apart from anything else, one of Plaatje's main sources of income during the time that he was in London. And it also left him with a kind of fascination with phonetics that you can see sort of coming through later on in his life. Now, Plaatje saw both these 2 books as being about preservation, about preserving Setswana, its correct pronunciation as set out in the Reader, and then its proverbs, but also about asserting the language's value and its status, and as a language worthy of preservation. So in the Proverbs, the very act of setting down Setswana proverbs with their English equivalents was to stake a claim. And the fact that he found English equivalents to most Setswana proverbs showed, in his view, that they shared a common wisdom. And their wealth and variety, he wrote, showed that Setswana was fully equipped for the expression of thought. Now, Plaatje's time in England also provided the impetus to embark upon another project, translating Shakespeare into Setswana. And this led eventually to the publication of Diposho Posho, which was his translation of the Comedy of Errors, and to Dinshonsho Tsabo Julius Caesar, Julius Caesar, published actually only after his death. And these were the first translations of Shakespeare into any African languages, not just any South African language. And another 4 plays which he translated, including Othello, tragically have been lost. So what was Plaatje trying to do? I mean, why this fascination with Shakespeare? Why go to such effort and expense? I mean, he ended up actually himself having to pay for the publication of the Comedy of Errors, since no publisher was interested in taking it on. Now, we've got some clues, because Plaatje himself wrote about Shakespeare's appeal to him at the time of the tercentenary of Shakespeare's death in 1916, when he was still in London. And in his contribution to the book, he made it clear that he'd been fascinated by Shakespeare from an early age, that he was struck by the universality of Shakespeare's characters, and that he admired Shakespeare for the way that he dealt with matters of race and colour. And I show these pictures of Alice Werner and Israel Gollancz, who were the two people I think particularly associated with on the project. Gollancz was the editor of the volume. Alice Werner was a lecturer in African languages at King's College, where Gollancz was, and I think she was really the contact that brought Plaatje's involvement in the project. Just interesting to note in passing that it actually got some pretty good reviews, certainly as far as Plaatje was concerned. The reviews were pretty kind of critical of the volume as a whole. It consisted of about 160 kind of different short contributions, so it was a bit all over the place. But it was interesting that several of the reviews did actually single out Plaatje as being one of the more interesting contributions to the book, and that's just the front cover and one of the pages. As you can see, it was written in both Setswana with an English translation running alongside. Now, Plaatje was very much struck also by the similarities, and he makes this clear in this article, the similarities between many of Shakespeare's themes and what he knew of the history and traditions of his own people. So things like kinship rivalries, and divided kingdoms, superstition, sorcery, murderous ambition, exile and return, all had their counterparts. And so much so, he said, that some of the stories on which Shakespeare's dramas were based were likely to find equivalents in African folklore, and that he thought translating Shakespeare into Setswana could be done. So let's look a little bit more closely at Diposho Posho and what Plaatje is doing here, and why Comedy of Errors, one might ask, not usually regarded as one of Shakespeare's more popular plays. Well, one reason, I think, was that it's the shortest of Shakespeare's plays, actually by quite a large margin. So given that Plaatje was going to have to raise the money to publish and print the book himself, it would also be the cheapest, and I think that was probably an important consideration. But there's also another set of reasons for its appeal, and I think these lie in some of the Comedy of Errors themes and the meanings that these had in Setswana culture too. For example, the question of twins, or the relationship between master and servant, or the question of witchcraft and sorcery. I mean, three of the key themes of Comedy of Errors, which do have particular resonance in Tswana culture as well. Witchcraft and sorcery, the equivalent being the whole concept of boloi, which was kind of very widespread, widely believed at the time that Plaatje was writing. So how did Plaatje go about it? I mean, first of all, it's clear, I think, that his priority was to come up with something that did not seem like a translation. What he was after, he said, was a Setswana book that speaks Setswana. It was a free rather than a literal translation. It drew upon the resources of Setswana, for example, its rich store of proverbs, to tell the tale in a way that made sense to Botswana. And he took plenty of liberties. Dialogue is condensed, and prose replaces blank verse. Passages are omitted or paraphrased, and speech is even reassigned from one person to another. I think he pretty much kept the kind of storyline, but it was considerably shortened. He didn't deviate from, I think he wasn't trying to kind of give another message to what Shakespeare was saying. He was simply providing it in a very different context. So the context throughout becomes the worlds of the Botswana. Now, according to one critic, it's as if he looked up from the text and then thinks and reformulates the context in Setswana. Thus, Aegeon, the Duke of Syracuse, is addressed as if he were a Tswana chief, his subjects displaying deference and respect in appropriate idiom. So he's addressed, when translated back into English, as Big Lion, the mighty one of the lakes, the allusion being not only to the traditional symbol of strength and power, Tau or lion, but to the mythical origins of the Botswana in the Great Lakes of Central Africa. And when it comes to the treatment of the servile status of the two Dromios, the two servants in Comedy of Errors, the language Plaatje uses is that of bolata, or meaning servitude or slavery, the term applied to the system that gave Botswana chiefs and others more or less complete control over the lives of their subordinates, who very often were Masarawa or Bushmen in old terminology. So all of this, I think, would have been very familiar to Plaatje's Tswana-speaking readers. So I think Plaatje relished the challenge to show that Setswana had the capacity to convey the substance of Shakespeare's plays, suitably recontextualized, and that they provided convenient storylines for him to embark upon the task. Now, seen this way, I think it's more helpful to point to the way Plaatje made use of Shakespeare for his own ends and his own purposes, rather than to suggest, as has been done, that he was a victim of a kind of cultural imperialism that's often associated with the spread of Shakespeare worldwide, that Plaatje was simply another who bowed down before Shakespeare in awe of his reputation as the greatest writer in the English language. A familiar assertion, perhaps, especially in the context of today's debates about decolonisation. But I don't think this really captures the complexities of the situation, or indeed of the agency that Plaatje actually exercised. So again, as with Mhudi, it's interesting, I think, to ask what sort of reaction or response there was to what Plaatje was doing. And I think the truth was that very few people, black or white, were much interested in such a seemingly odd exercise. Even those who might have been sympathetic to his work in Setswana, like the academic linguists, for example, thought that he would have been better concentrating his efforts elsewhere, in doing something more useful. And I think there was always a sense, certainly on the part of the academics and the anthropologists, that Setswana or any African language, this was not the thing to be doing, to be kind of diluting its purity with an association, with a language like English. So there was something of the reaction that there was to Mhudi. It was neither African or European, but fell between the two. And what right, moreover, some asked, did Plaatje have to be concerning himself with high English culture? In the increasingly segregationist climate of the late 1920s and early 1930s, some simply thought this was not an appropriate exercise. Which is not to say that there were not some who did appreciate its contribution to Setswana literature. His friend David Ramashwana, a teacher, was full of praise for it. And he said that Plaatje had succeeded in proving wrong all those who said that Shakespeare could not be translated into an African language because, they argue, European and African tongues, nations and outlook differ so irreconcilably that elevated ideas must remain to the African an impenetrable mystery. So politics was really never very far beneath the surface. Were these read? Actually, in time, they were. And I guess there's a kind of an irony that certainly in South Africa, as certainly in the 1940s, 1950s, when Bantu education came in, they were desperate for books in African languages, Plaatje's Shakespeare translations were amongst the very few non-religious things that had been written in Setswana. So interesting that actually Plaatje probably sold far more copies, sold after his death, than I would say any of the books that he'd written in English. He had actually a particular fan in Bechuanaland. There was an idiosyncratic High Commissioner called Colonel Ray, and he was very keen on Plaatje's translation because he was desperate for something for his schools, the students in the schools to study that was not religious. He had a thing about, I don't know if any of you have read a wonderful diary that he wrote, but he had a big thing about missionaries who he just did not like. But of course he was dependent upon them for delivering the education. So Plaatje appealed as providing a kind of secular alternative. Now, Plaatje's determination to get his Shakespeare translations into print is better understood, I think, if considered in the context of what else he was trying to do with Setswana at this time. During the last few years of his life, he was engaged in working on a new Setswana dictionary. He felt the existing one was quite inadequate. In preparing an expanded new version, a new edition of his Setswana proverbs, and in compiling a collection of Tswana folk tales and praise poems. Now, all were part of his project to create a written literature in Setswana, for he was desperately concerned about the fate of his language, and he felt that it had to have a written literature if it was to have any chance of survival. And along with this went a parallel effort on his part to defend Setswana as the government launched an initiative in the 1920s and early 1930s to reform the orthographies of African languages. Reform, I think, certainly was needed, but not in the top-down, technocratic and undemocratic manner that they embarked upon. And for Plaatje, this was a matter for the Botswana to sort out themselves, not to be dictated to by the government. So alongside his struggle to create a written language for Setswana, he waged a bitter campaign to frustrate the efforts of the language reformers, because that, as he saw it, was a grave threat to Setswana as well. So he feared that Setswana would be subsumed within larger, more powerful languages, and this battle really became, towards the end of his life, his overriding priority. And he recognized, I think, particularly after the general election of 1929, and this was the one that returned General Herzog with an outright majority for the National Party. I think he felt at that point that the political struggle, for his generation at least, had been lost, and that the cultural defence of his people had now become his priority. So let me try and say a few words in conclusion. And I think I would say that Plaatje, as a writer, was extraordinarily versatile and wide-ranging in what he chose to write about, in the kind of projects that he undertook. And I hope that I've given you a bit of a flavour of this in this lecture this evening. But he was equally at home in English and Setswana, and he felt that he had every right to use both as he pleased. Not for him, I think, the agonised debates over the language issue that have preoccupied later generations. Plaatje simply delighted in making connections between the two languages, and whether this was incorporating elements of Tswana culture and tradition in Mhudi, in English, or in using Shakespeare's plays to assist in the development of written Setswana, to help him show what it was capable of, and to provide him with a showcase for the deployment in context of Tswana proverbs. So I think these thoughts perhaps point us in the direction of what might be considered Plaatje's greatest achievement and legacy. The idea that in South Africa's multiplicity of cultural and linguistic traditions, and in the interaction between them, that there lay not so much a problem as a huge asset, a source of creativity and great human potential. And few South Africans, I hope I've suggested in the 3 lectures, have done as much to demonstrate just how this potential could be realised, and in the face of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. So that concludes my 3rd and final lecture. So thank you again for listening, and I think we've got perhaps 10 minutes for any questions, discussion, if you'd like to do that. So thank you. Sorry, can you speak up a bit?
Do you have any manuscript for salt Plaatje, like recent publications?
You're talking about manuscripts that have not been published?
No, is it published papers for salt Plaatje?
There are there's the main collection of Plaatje's papers is at Wits University in Johannesburg. There are some letters. There's some of his manuscripts. There was a lot of correspondence that he wrote, letters that he wrote to members of the Molema family. And they were really the people responsible for keeping all of that material. So that's and actually all of that collection is available online. Anybody can just go on the internet and see what is there. So that's freely available to anybody if you go to the Wits University Historical Papers collection. It doesn't include any manuscript of Plaatje's published books. There have been manuscripts of Mhudi. The Rhodes University Library has the manuscript of that. There's also, there's a number of other items elsewhere. But I don't know. That's what you were wondering about?
Yeah, I think because there's a very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah. But I think there's probably more material that has survived of Sol Plaatje's than most of other people that I can think of his generation. There are people about whom very little material has survived, and yet, who were important literary figures. Yeah. Okay.
He's an absolutely remarkable person. He's a real Renaissance man that seems to have appeared from heaven only knows where. But, just going back to your original lecture, apart from his, what he learned through the missionaries, he doesn't seem to have done anything, as we might say, temporary these days. It seems he was almost, as a writer, almost self-taught through what he read himself. After he left the missionary teachings, what additional teaching did he have?
That's a really good question. I think that he, before he left the mission station, I think he did actually benefit quite considerably from the tuition, the kind of extra school tuition that he got from the Westphal family. But it's clear also that when he went to work in Kimberley for the post office, and that 4.5 years that he spent, I think what's amazing to me is that you look at his Mafikeng diary, written 1899. It's an incredible piece of writing. It's just absolutely fascinating. And for him to have got to that level of competence, with English, where it was reported, that when he went to Kimberley in 1894, his English, was far from perfect. But I think he'd certainly made a very conscious effort during the time that he was there